Hello.
Hi all.
So we're here today with some matcha. Again, the jade leaf matcha from this month's subscription. As we get set up, has anyone had the matcha yet this month? Any opinions?
Have you had matcha before? And entering into matcha is kind of weird and different for a lot of folks. It's definitely, I think, one way to think of it. For folks who aren't used to matcha or are new to matcha, kind of engaging with it like espresso and coffee. Where you're basically getting a really concentrated small amount of tea in the same way that you would use coffee beans brewed and make a very small, dense beverage of espresso. Because of that, I know for myself, I need to eat before I drink matcha, so I'm doing some snacking. And really, matcha is one of those teas for me that does hit your stomach pretty hard. I know some folks don't have that problem, and that's weird to me. We went with matcha for this month because we think it works really well for spring moving into summer, and also kind of an entry into more Japanese teas. We've been doing a few Chinese teas and figured change the wheelhouse a little bit and go with that. So right now what Jace is doing is they're working on making up their bowl of matcha that we'll actually be sharing today. And the first step after warming the bowl and softening the whisk is to strain the matcha or pass it through a sieve. That'll help break down large clumps. That'll allow you to make a smoother, frothier beverage. And I think at least a large part of matcha is the textural component of the drink. It should be kind of thick and viscous. What's your thought on matcha, Jace?
Yeah, so it looks like someone in the comments mentioned that the matcha was more bitter than they expected, and that was kind of my first response to matcha in my life as well. I also have a major sweet tooth, so a lot of things are a little more bitter than I want. And this more traditional preparation of matcha, because it's so concentrated, does emphasize like all of the flavors all at once, which can be a little bit overwhelming. And it does show the astringency of the tea plant that some of the other teas don't always get to because of the concentration of it. It's hard to necessarily get away from all of the more complex and bitter notes in matcha, which is also why a lot of people enjoy matcha as an ingredient and not just straight by itself. So what's really popular nowadays is matcha lattes, where you brew up a shot of matcha basically and mix it with some milk and maybe add some sugar. And that definitely softens the hit for a lot of people. One thing to note for if you're brewing matcha more traditionally with the tea bowl and the bamboo whisk is that you want to whisk in side-to-side zigzag motions. That incorporates the matcha a little better than round motions that Westerners are taught to use for cooking whisking.
So Jason's just made up a little bit of a froth in our bowl.
Yeah.
Try to see if
try to show you a little bit of froth. That's the goal with the whisk. That also helps with the more bitter notes.
Yeah.
The froth kind of brings a lightness to the flavors.
Matcha's a more interesting tea and like the history of tea, as well as in consumption of it, because you're actually ingesting the tea leaves. So you're not actually making a tea liquor in the way that you would take hot water and leaf and then have them brew together and strain to then have a final beverage. Instead, we're actually making a suspended solution where the particles are in the matrix of the water floating around.
Yeah, and I think that also contributes to the stronger notes of matcha, because you're getting absolutely everything with it, not just the byproduct of the leaf. So,
Is there any particular thing about matcha and its history and its cultural relevance that kind of got you to land on wanting this one for this month, Chase? Yeah.
Not one thing in particular. I did definitely want to introduce matcha because I think it's a very special beverage. And, I come from a more Japanese background going into tea. Hi, someone said hi. And so, a lot of the tea world kind of focuses more on the Chinese aspect of tea because that's where tea was developed. And China has the biggest tea drinking population in the world. So there's a lot of focus on China, but there are other countries, Japan included, and going past Japan into Sri Lanka, Kenya, like India, tea's everywhere. And I think it's easy to kind of get lost in Chinese tea because it's so prevalent. And Japanese tea, it's one of the first steps out of Chinese tea for most people, because it was one of the first countries to start cultivating tea after China, historically speaking. And matcha is the first style of tea that was brought to Japan, and Japan kind of honed in on it. Are you finishing it?
Yeah.
I don't want it, so that's okay. But yeah, so matcha has a really interesting history of originally being a Chinese style of tea. But by the time it went to Japan, it was out of favor. There were other styles more used in China. So we see Japan really focusing hard on this one style of tea for a very long time, and perfecting it, some people would say.
Yeah. Getting some statements in the chat. Stuck with it.
Yeah,
A good bit of extra water, which helps a lot with bitterness. Yeah, so that's definitely a thing of trying to figure out what the right ratio of water to grounds is for any person's particular personal preference. I like to do a very thick matcha that tends to be a lot bitter than what many folks like. And it's almost like a light paint kind of consistency to it.
Yeah, and that's also an older style of matcha. Thicker matcha is more traditional. It's which one is it? Is it Koicha or Usucha? There's two styles, Usucha and Koicha. I'm not remembering the translations very quickly right now.
Yeah.
But if you really deep dive into the history of matcha, you can kind of see when the style changed, and it kind of correlates to matcha drinking leaving the Buddhist monastery and becoming more popular among common people, I think.
I can't remember.
Yeah. But I think that's what happened. But so if you go to a Japanese tea ceremony done by a monk, it's more likely that you'll have a thicker matcha than a ceremony done by someone who is not a monk.
Yeah. What's also kind of interesting, and Jay started to allude to it earlier, is with the cultivation of matcha and tea in Japan, we start to see kind of one of the more distinct differences that I see existing in Japanese tea culture versus Chinese or Taiwanese tea culture, and that is a mind to better, for lack of better terms, codify and codify teas. And we're going to get into this in next month's subscription topic, where we start to break down more of what's cultivation and what does that really do when you're using a different cultivar in production of a commonly known tea.
Yeah, so I'm brewing up a different tea right now. This is a gyokuro. Looks like I didn't go long enough, which makes sense because my sense of time is very off today.
Yeah.
So I'm going to pour it back in because I don't think we got much.
And what's going on with matcha is it's a lot that's very dense and pretty bold for flavors. So for that, generally, I find I'll only have a bowl of it at a time. A bowl also equating to maybe 70 grams of beverage, or 70 milliliters, sorry, volume versus weight. Thanks. And because of that, it's a good thing to have, but then sometimes you're wanting more. And I find going to something like a gokura, another Japanese tea, but with pretty different notes in it, and tends to be a little more palatable for long times of tea drinking, I find.
So in the comments, we have someone saying that they also got into Japanese tea first, still drinking genmaicha every morning, and discovering Chinese teas a little more recently. Genmaicha is a really fun Japanese tea. For those who don't know, it's a sencha mixed with toasted rice. So it has a really interesting flavor, and it's kind of fun to look at while you're brewing as well.
Pretty nutty, and it's a great morning tea. Also, I think a great late afternoon tea if you're a person that caffeine doesn't really hit you in the way that kind of keeps you up and awake. It can be good in that way. What else do you want to talk about matcha, Jace?
Well, let's talk about caffeine, because we kind of talked on how matcha is a higher concentration of the leaf, because you're mixing the leaf directly with the water and drinking that solution. And what a lot of people find is that along with that, you'll feel more caffeinated more quickly with matcha, which is why I really like to equate it to an espresso shot. On our menu for the shop, we list this semi-traditional method for making matcha as a matcha shot, to kind of get people's understanding of it a little more accurate, because it's not necessarily a drink.
Yeah, it's one of those things of hedging expectations. You tell someone, hey, I've got this really nice, bright, vibrant, little bitter green Japanese tea matcha for you. And then you hand them a small vessel with 2-3 centimeters of beverage in it. There's
People are like, why?
There's a different
this isn't what thought. I thought. And that thought also kind of helps people's understanding of how they might feel after drinking the the matcha.
Mhm.
Because if you're thinking of it as more of an espresso shot, then you're like, oh, I'm going to get fast energy.
Pick me up.
Yeah. Which is also kind of an interesting difference between Chinese green teas and Japanese green teas as well. The processing differences between those two subcategories kind of allows a different caffeinated feeling, where Japanese green teas often feel more caffeinating than Chinese green teas. But that's often just because they end up having a shorter life. You brew Japanese green teas with fewer infusions. The flavor lasts a little bit less. So you're still getting about the same amount of caffeine, whether you're drinking a Chinese green or a Japanese green tea, but what you're feeling is a little different.
Now, is matcha, what leaves make up matcha? So we know, how we're growing a leaf, growing a plant, harvesting the leaf. After we harvest a leaf, what makes that leaf turn into matcha versus sencha, usicha, other Japanese green tea varieties?
Well, first and foremost, it's about the youthfulness of a leaf. The leaf that gets turned into matcha is most often the youngest. And it's seen as kind of a higher quality. And what's also interesting is that young growth tends to be more full of all the things. So it's like higher caffeine, higher polyphenols, flavors. It's brighter flavor and color. And, that's how all plants are.
More chlorophyll, so that's why it has that really bright, almost neon green color.
Yeah, so if we look back at the powder, it's a very vibrant green, and that's pretty standard for matcha, whereas many other teas are a little bit more dull or dark. It's a really cool green.
Get that, yeah.
Yeah.
Just trying to get into the processing of matcha. So what makes matcha matcha, I guess, is the question that we're trying to ascertain.
Yeah, so it's about the leaf and the processing. So as I started saying, the leaf that goes into matcha is often going to be a higher quality leaf. That doesn't mean that other teas are less at all, but they're the guidelines basically for plucking leaf for different things changes based off of what you're making. And then that continues throughout the entire processing, where as the leaf gets cooked and dried and shaped before it gets ground into the powder, it's continuously sorted through, and what's not desirable gets taken out. A little, and this is the same for most teas, but I've found that matcha tends to get the sorting a little bit more intensely than some other teas. Someone's mentioning grades. The grades of matcha also correlate to when the leaf was plucked. So a higher grade matcha will always have younger growth, more younger growth in it than a lower grade matcha. So a matcha that gets plucked very early spring will almost always be a high grade. The grade can also change depending on what happens during processing. Sometimes mistakes happen, and so it ends up not turning out to be what you want it to be, and then it'll be a lower grade or decided to not be suitable at all for drinking. Whereas a lower grade will often be plucked later in the season. And later in the season for matcha is still pretty early.
And is the harvesting of matcha, is that coming from the same tea plant that is also going to be producing sencha?
Usually, yes. Sencha is the most produced tea in Japan, and often the plants that go into matcha also go into sencha, and that's, from my understanding, mostly just to get the most that you can out of your farm.
Yeah, and it's the thing that's making it matcha is the taking the leaf, producing something like a sencha. So you're going through the whole process of making a high quality leaf tea that can be brewed, and then you're grinding it on big machines and getting it down into this very fine powder. The process of doing that can create different flavor profiles that will arrive then.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I also, in the periodical, we also talked a bit about the different cultivars. Cultivars are a very big topic in tea in general, but the conversation changes in Japan, specifically because multiple cultivars are used for one type of tea more often than in any other country. And in matcha in particular, you getting blends of cultivars. It's becoming more common now, but it used to be very uncommon to have a single cultivar matcha. And that was purely to like curate a flavor palette. People would blend different cultivars in to get like their desired flavor that one cultivar generally isn't able to do.
So that is, of course, taking one that has higher, sweeter notes in it, and maybe they're too sweet, or you have this other one that has very nice nutty qualities to it. So you'll take some of that sweetness, that cultivar that has that sweetness that you like, and blend them together until you get those notes that you want. And as Jace was saying, it is a pretty common thing in Japan of blending different cultivars to get the flavor profile that you want in the finished tea, packaged tea. And I'm sure it happens more than what is reported to happen in Chinese and Taiwanese teas as well. It's just, as again tends to be the trend in Japanese tea, is a better track record of staying on top of things. Mm-hmm. And as someone's asking or mentioning, kind of equating it to whiskey, blending different whiskeys to get a better or just a different notes, mm-hmm. And a different option.
Yeah. I like paralleling conversation of cultivars in tea to wine, because they're treated very similarly, where particularly if you're looking at countries that do tend to favor having a fewer amount of cultivars for each type of tea, like China, you'll see that like it's similar to wine, where you like one type of grape goes towards one type of wine. But then there's this trend of blending grapes to make different profiles, and that happens with tea. I use wine because I don't know many other alcohols very detailed, but it happens in whiskey as well, and it happens with coffee. It's not as straightforward as people want to think. People tend to think that tea tends to be more simple than these other drinks that we have, but it's not. It's just as complicated.
And matcha is kind of a fun way to get into the history of Japan, if you want to, especially because if you have a short attention span, you can use matcha to get into possibly the most interesting period of Japan into the Sengoku period, starting around then, which is really new in Japanese history by comparison to all of its history, which is the start of the unification of Japan. And you get into things like samurais and daimyos and the slow kind of eating away of the West onto Japan, and can see kind of the creation of a truly codified Japanese tea culture, being a way that the nobility kind of centers themselves as what defines Japanese-ness.
Yeah, in this era surrounding the unification of Japan, we really see Japan leaving the concept of putting China on a pedestal. For a very long time, Japan, pretty much exclusively traded with China, and they got all of their fashion and like sense of art from China. It's very much how the relationship between England and France, where like French things were seen as like the most fashionable thing in England. It was similar in Japan. But once you get towards like after the introduction of matcha and towards the unification of Japan, you're seeing more internal look at Japan itself and trying to figure out what is the Japanese identity as the country is forming. And matcha plays a pretty big part in that.
Yeah. As someone in the chat is stating, the degree to which the tea ceremony, Chana Yu, I've got to assume their meaning, inspired architecture and thought is also really interesting. And I think that's able to happen also, again, because it was latched on to as a point of Japanese cultural identity that then spiraled outwards from there. Whereas it seems that in Chinese or Taiwanese, even tea cultures, the architecture history existed, and then tea kind of started to permeate it and work with it. Whereas for in Japan, it's kind of this blossoming together of them both kind of exploring the same principles at the same time.
Yeah. And what, like specifically if we're talking about China in comparison to Japan, it's really interesting to look at cultural developments through the lens of tea, because like they greatly affect each other. As China became more unified, you're seeing more people drink tea and more development within the tea culture and processing styles in China. And it's the same with Japan. Once Japan became more unified, there was like a huge prevalence of figuring out how matcha is part of Japanese culture, and it was very much a top-down process of the daimyo and shogun, the warlords of Japan, loved the developing tea ceremony and matcha and Zen aesthetics and thought. And so they became part of the creators of this Japanese aesthetic that is still pretty prevalent today.
It's also a little interesting that they kind of, the daimyo, samurai, and the shogunate really stumbled across tea and matcha as kind of accident-ish, which is they discovered it was really good about curing hangovers that they had. And they felt better generally after they drank it, and they were feeling more awake and vibrant. And from that, it then starts to go in that direction of just this huge cultural change.
Yeah. Does anyone watching have other thoughts on matcha or the culture around tea in Japan or China, or any other thoughts at all? We've had a few sessions of talking about tea together, and I know questions sometimes come up outside of meeting with people, so we're also happy to talk about non-matcha things.
In general, questions, comments, concerns, in or out of those orders. As Jace was saying, we're having some other Japanese teas today, and we'll actually be continuing in our next periodical with another Japanese tea for the month of June. That's how calendars work.
Yeah. And with next month, we'll be continuing this conversation of the development of Japanese tea culture and the history of tea. We're really enjoying Tea Club as well.
Yeah.
We like talking about tea with everyone. Oh, someone's moving to Japan soon.
In the fall, and definitely looking forward to tea scene even more. Yeah.
If you know where in Japan you're going to end up, we can try to give you some pointers that we know about.
Yeah.
And also ask you to bring some back for us.
I'm very excited to, continue with this tea club. And of course, in our shop, we're still not open to in-person consumption these days, but we're looking forward to hopefully, as things change around here and what's doable, continuing these sessions digitally, but also looking forward to trying to have more in-person tea groups and hangout sessions that will be hopefully pretty informal, and folks can come in, hang out, drink tea, chat, and go on like that.
Yeah. I've also been trying to figure out how to do tea classes again, whether that's going to be virtually or in person or a mixture of the two. And, I've been building a tea class, but if anyone specifically wants a subject, let me know and I can build a class for you.
And as we're doing this, we're also trying to figure out other topics that folks other than just us might like to explore in these periodicals. And if there's anything that you feel particularly drawn to, chances are we have a tea around that we would love to use to talk about those things with people, or what have you. Sorry, there's something in my throat.
Yeah. I had a thought and then it went away.
So we're happy to share tea with all of you and to keep it going. Matcha is definitely a thing that I suggest everyone keeps drinking and have available to you. Though I will advise for many folks, myself included, not to keep on the matcha train a few bowls in a row. We saw in the chat earlier someone else saying that they're really enjoying it, but it's definitely tea that gets them going and can have troubles relaxing at the later part of the day because of that.
Yeah, once you get to 3 or 4 bowls in, you might be in the danger zone. Definitely take a break, drink some water, eat some food, and then maybe come back if you want to stay awake for 24 hours.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like they've committed to 3 bowls, which fair.
Is a choice.
Yeah. We also have tins of this matcha available, just the ceremonial grade. At our shop, we have, I think, 50-gram tins and 100-gram tins. So a lot more than what we sent out for the subscription. So if you are in need of more matcha because you've drunk through it all already, you're welcome to buy some. And if you need it shipped to you, just let us know. We can do that.
To help. I don't have a whole lot more on matcha to really talk about myself. It's definitely one of those teas that I'll have maybe once or twice a week. And it's definitely a tea that I've got to be in the mood for. Mm-hmm. That also is to say, it's a tea I suggest you try to get your friends to have and to share with them. But walk them to it. It's definitely a good tea. It's definitely a bit more than some people are expecting. And as someone's saying, it's a tea that you definitely have to be present for. Mm-hmm. And that makes sense and really connects to its history as entering into the cultural zeitgeist through Zen Buddhism, mm-hmm. as really being a grounding focal point of a meditative session.
Yeah, like many other drinks that are created from powder, I'm thinking about hot chocolate specifically. If you let matcha sit, it'll get granular again, and it won't really be a great texture, which is, a great reason to continue brewing it in this more traditional manner of the tea bowl and whisk, because then you're getting just a small amount and it's a few sips worth, and it's a great short experience, and it's a little harder to forget about it if it's just going to be a couple sips. But yeah, another aspect of matcha that we haven't talked about yet is using it in cooking. I sent out my cookie recipe with the subscription for our matcha shortbread cookies that we use as the base for our matcha macadamia nut cookies in the shop. And it can be a really great addition to desserts and drinks. I saw recently someone make a matcha mojito, which I'm very interested in because mojito is one of my favorite drinks. But yeah, you can throw it in a lot of things. I know a lot of people who use it in smoothies as well. My general advice for if you're going to be using it in something is watch how much you're going to put in. Be aware of the portions of matcha that you're using. Generally for drinks, you still want to stick to like 1 to 2 teaspoons. For food, recipes usually call for 3 to 6 teaspoons of matcha, and that's kind of dependent on how many servings you're making. I've found that sometimes the cookies are a little more caffeinating than people expect. We recently had to advise someone not to give it to their toddler.
Yeah.
Because that was a little dangerous there.
I think this was a really good session of tea drinking, some conversations. And looking forward to having more going forward.
Yeah, and feel free to tell us how you're exploring with tea at any point. If you have questions or want to share something exciting, just share with us.
Yeah, feel free to tag us in questions on social media. We're on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube, rather, obviously, all of which at Lion Turtle Tea. That's lion as in the animal, turtle as in the animal, tea as in the beverage.
Our spiel to tell people how to spell our name over the phone.
Yeah. It's great having tea with you all. And we're looking forward to the next time that we can have it together. and even more so the next time that we can share a cup in person.
I think we'll stop for now, but continue drinking some delicious tea and we'll catch you later.
Thanks a lot.